Despite being drenched in sweat right now, it's allegedly autumn in the UK and I've got quite the reading list to get through. This isn't the entire list. I'm planning on being pretty savvy with my library usage. This is just all the physical books that I have with me now. I had a pretty light-hearted summer. A lot of romance was read, and so to get revenge on myself and to remind myself what it feels like to be emotionally punched in the stomach and throat at the same time, I'm going to be reading a lot of quite emotional books. There is a reason for this. I basically have got quite into reading books about grief because my mum died when I was younger, and I feel like I'm not a self-help person. I don't like self-help, but I've happened to read books with themes of grief and have really enjoyed it and found it a very fruitful, emotive, healthy activity. Autumn is technically 3 months apparently, and so I worked out that I would read about 16 books. The first book that I'm reading, that I actually started on the 1st of September, on the 3rd of September, is The White Album by Joan Didion. So this is set in the 60s. It's a collection of essays and it's my first time reading Joan Didion. And this essay collection is meant to be a really iconic look at America in the 60s. Because she's a journalist, she also has access to some pretty interesting people. So the Black Panthers feature a lot, Janis Joplin, and she talks a lot about crime as well. You've got the Charles Manson girls. Next up, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I haven't actually read any Virginia Woolf, but I managed to get those £5 ballet tickets to see Woolf Works, which was a ballet at the Royal Opera House in London. Very fancy, and it compelled me to hurry up on reading Woolf. I feel like she's been on my TBR for ages, but for some reason classics don't shift up the TBR that easily because you're kind of like, oh, they'll always be there for me. To the Lighthouse is meant to be very typical Woolf, so it uses a stream of consciousness technique, and it is meant to be quite philosophical, all about how complex and varied people and people's lives can be. That's pretty much all I know about it. I'm a little bit intimidated, but I am also excited. It'll be a journey for sure. I'm gonna be reading Dune by Frank Herbert, and this one I'm pretty scared for because it's a massive book. I also don't really read fantasy ever, and I feel like people who read fantasy watching this video, finding out that Dune is gonna be my first fantasy book, are gonna be screaming at the screen telling me not to do that, because Dune sounds quite complicated, quite long and intimidating, and I'm just gonna hope for the best. I read a bit about it. So it's set on a desert planet, and there's meant to be this mineral that, or mineral stone, there's a precious thing that's in very short supply, but everyone is warring over it. It helps you live longer and also makes you more intelligent, and that's the premise. A lot of fantasy books, I think it's probably because of the length, I find that their plots get touched on a lot less when you look at the synopsis. Shorter books, you have a better understanding of the plot, but fantasy books, it's just like, yeah, 2 famous houses, lots of fighting, one precious thing they're fighting over. Like, that is all you find out about the book, and that's what I'm experiencing with Dune. It also talks about the main character evolving into the mysterious man known as Dib, which I'm curious about, because what, evolving literally? Like, this is the thing with fantasy. I have no idea what the boundaries are. Anyway, Rouge by Mona Awad is a book that I'm very excited to read. She is the same person who wrote Bunny, which, if you don't know, is a kind of weird, people describe it as dark academia, about a girl who ends up in a cult and it sort of spirals and it all gets a bit weird. And Rouge sounds fairly similar. It's described as a horror-tinted gothic fairy tale, and it's about a lonely dress shop clerk whose mother's unexpected death sends her down a treacherous path in pursuit of youth and beauty. It's the most delicious sounding book and I'm extremely excited to read it. I think it's also a new release as of September, so hot off the press. Yeah, further description: Snow White meets Eyes Wide Shut in this surreal descent into the dark side of beauty, envy, grief, and the complicated love between mothers and daughters. This sounds like Bunny, but potentially even more meaty than Bunny. So Yeah, and it sounds very like her style. It's kind of humorous and dark, but also cutesy, and I don't know, it's just quite a fun combo of things. In a very similar vein, I'm gonna finally read The Girls by Emma Cline. This is about a young girl who ends up in a cult. It's set in Northern California. Again, I don't know much more about it, but the setting I really enjoy, especially currently reading the White Album. I'm very intrigued by California settings. Taking quite an aggressive swerve, I'm going to be reading The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is a memoir, and I believe it's the book that she is considered like the thing that made her shoot to crazy stardom. It's about a time in her life where she experiences a lot of grief. Her husband dies, her daughter is ill, and quite soon after she also experiences health issues. Like, a lot of terrible things happen in a very small period of time. The book talks about the aftermath of that, and it's obviously a memoir, so it's a very close look at that. I so far really like her writing style actually in the White Album. It feels like you're talking to a friend, so I'm really interested to see that writing style applied in her memoir. Another grief book, Will This House Last Forever by Xanthi Barker. So this is by the daughter of Sebastian Barker, who was a famous poet, and she talks about how he was very absent throughout her childhood, and then when he died, that added a layer of complication to the grief because she was losing someone that she maybe didn't ever really know. I also read a review of this book that really compelled me to read it. She sort of plays with the tenses, or she probably doesn't play with them, it's just how it came out a bit. Past and present tense get confused a bit, and I definitely know that with grief that's so true. It's very bizarre suddenly talking about someone in the past tense, and you find yourself being unsure which tense to use, or using one, it's sounding weird, replaying it again. There's a huge awkwardness with that. And then also even just use of a tense, you know how powerful that is if you're talking to someone who doesn't know. You just kind of, it's weird, and so I'm very interested to see it in here. Her father, the deceased, is also addressed as you in the book, and the review described it as awkwardly direct but suits the open, youthful and uncensored prose. I don't know why I've stacked all these grief books together in this list. I'm not going to actually necessarily read them in the order that I'm telling you about them. So The Last Act of Love. When Cathy was 17, her brother Matty was her best friend. A year younger and much taller, he was clever, funny and outgoing, but one night in the summer of 1990, Matty was knocked down by a car and never walked or spoke again. 8 years later, he died. This is a true story of a happy family ambushed by loss, the unknown place between life and death, and how to find love and joy in the world, even when you know it'll never be the same again. I don't have anything to add other than I can imagine that grief when you lose a sibling versus a parent is an incredibly different kind of grief. So I think this will be a very educational experience for me. Next up, and I think hopefully my final one in my list of grief books, The Death of Ivan Illich. So this isn't a memoir, which I think might make it a bit easier to read. This is by Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, the extremely famous Russian author. I haven't actually read any of his works. This is the first one that I'm gonna read, and it's meant to be one of the books to read about death. It's very philosophical and intense. It centers around a high court judge who has never thought about death and then is suddenly confronted with it. I just love that angle anyway, but it's also meant to be a result of a huge spiritual crisis that Tolstoy had. People, Places and Things is a play by Duncan Macmillan. I've been really wanting to read more plays recently. They are shorter, and so just a really good little palette cleanser between books, and I also enjoy the rhythm. They kind of remind me of poetry. They're somewhere in between books and poems. This starts in rehab, and it's all about mental health and substance abuse and trying to get better. But I think this was recommended to me, was it by a person or was it by an algorithm? I can't remember. After reading Fleabag. Shuggie Bain is also on my autumn reading list. This is by Douglas Stuart. I read Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I loved Young Mungo. It's pretty heavy, but so well written, and one of those books where I just, each line just explodes my brain. Like, I just can't believe things can be said so well. This book sounds really similar to Young Mungo if you just read the synopsis. So it's about a sweet and lonely boy who spends his 1980s childhood in rundown public housing in Glasgow, Scotland. Thatcher's policies have put husbands and sons out of work, and the city's notorious drug epidemic is waiting in the wings. So very similar setting to Young Mungo, and I'm intrigued as to how it fares. Like, will I like this even more than I liked Young Mungo? I think it's pretty hard, but maybe. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy is my next book, and I think this might be a big scary book club book, as in one where I vlog the process, because I am a little bit afraid, but it is meant to be a classic, and Anna in particular is a character that so many people talk about. She seems to be very well loved. I'm also looking forward to reading a classic written by a man with a female protagonist, because as we know, sometimes the characters don't age well, but then other times I'm astounded at how modern characters feel. In one sentence, this book is about Anna, who is a sophisticated and I think quite wealthy woman who abandons her life of being fancy and her husband to pursue a very different life. Maybe for love. Maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe she changes it up for love. I don't know. But I believe it doesn't go well for Anna. The book is described as having no moral layer to the voice, so you're really just watching it all play out, and Tolstoy offers no like judgment and doesn't encourage the reader to judge, which I love. I'm very interested in that, especially my last Russian literature read was first and last, I don't know why I'm trying to sound like I've read loads of these massive books, is Crime and Punishment, and that was a huge moral question. Like, that was the whole point of the book, and so I'm interested to see how this style differs. Number 12 is Fleabag, the original play. Fleabag is obviously a TV show, but it was originally a monologue by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. I've read the TV script, like Fleabag the scriptures, but the original play I haven't got my hands on. I really want to just give the monologue a go and see how it fares, whether I learn anything new. And as I've said, I'm getting into plays, so that's kind of what that's about. Fleabag is about a woman in her early 30s. It's based in London, which I think is a part of why I have an affinity to it. And she is going through quite a lot of grief. Her life's a bit of a mess. It's just a really incredible story and punches me right in the heart and the gut and the throat. Slightly random, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. It's a classic, it's been on the list for a while. It's a comedy play, and I barely know what it's about. A fashionable young man who lives in the country with his ward Cecily. He's invited a rakish brother named Ernest, whose supposed exploits give Jack an excuse to travel to London periodically to rescue him. Sounds like a lot of fun. A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. Oh, I forgot to bring it here to show you. It's this tiny little pamphlet of the book, so it's going to be a very quick read. It's meant to be magical realism, which is a genre I haven't really dabbled in before, and it's about an old man with enormous wings who appears in a family's back garden one night, on a stormy night, by Gabriel García Márquez. Let's see how it goes. Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky will be the second book that I've read of his. As I mentioned, I've read Crime and Punishment, and I think this is a perfect supplement to that, or perfect one to read after those books. It was actually written before a lot of his most famous works, including Crime and Punishment, but it supposedly is an ideal introduction to the creative imagination, profundity, and uncanny psychological penetration of one of the most influential novelists of the 19th century. Finally, and probably my scariest book, or the scariest book on the list, we have The Stand by Stephen King. This is a post-apocalyptic dark fantasy novel. In case you were wondering, not my usual type of book, and it's over 1,000 pages long. This is definitely going to be a challenging read, but I think I'm up for it. I've done my training, I've been reading well for a year now, I think I'm ready. I've also never read any Stephen King before, and I know that the whole world raves about him. It just had to happen at some point, you know. This book is about a plague and the years that follow. You have two groups that are led by a personification of either good or evil and seem fated to clash with each other. Okay, so that is my pretty ambitious TBR, but what is a TBR if not ambitious? Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one. Have a lovely week. Goodbye.